It is Tuesday, November 28th, and this is The National. Tonight, why scientists around the world are watching this volcanic eruption in Bali so closely.
Another dangerous act of defiance by North Korea. What these missile tests tell us about the secretive regime.
But we begin with an emotional apology in the House of Commons. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called it this country's collective shame, how gay and lesbian Canadians were treated for decades. And so he stood in the House and apologized for the actions previous governments took against them simply because of their sexuality. It was a moment that was historic and moving.
Over our history, laws, policies enacted by the government led to the legitimization of much more than inequality. They legitimized hatred and violence and brought shame to those targeted. The state orchestrated a culture of stigma and fear around LGBTQ2 communities, and in doing so, destroyed people's lives. It is with shame and sorrow and deep regret for the things we have done that I stand here today and say, we were wrong, we apologize, I am sorry, we are sorry.
The apology was supported by all parties, although some Conservative MPs did not attend. Ottawa also introduced legislation to wipe out the criminal records of those who were convicted of consensual same-sex activity, and the government settled a lawsuit with those in the public service, the military, and the RCMP in the Cold War era who were fired for being gay. $110 million has now been set aside to compensate those whose careers were sidelined. Dozens of people who were wronged by government policy were invited to Parliament Hill. We caught up with one man who traveled across the country to hear the government say sorry.
I was the head of a department in a destroyer. I was a naval lieutenant.
Frank Letourneau's story isn't an uncommon one. A rising star in the Royal Canadian Navy, at just 26 years old, he led a team of 40 sailors aboard the HMCS Saguenay. Here he is in 1968, speaking to Radio-Canada. 2 years later, Letourneau's career abruptly ended when he was confronted by his superiors.
I'd been summoned to the military police office, and they presented me with a file that suggested that I led secretly a homosexual lifestyle.
Letourneau came from Halifax for this and invited guests of the government to hear an apology for the way he was treated all those many years ago. But how do you feel about what happened to you?
I think it was a total waste on the part of the government and the part of the Navy to let go someone who had performed well and who had a good career ahead of him. Furthermore, a francophone. The Navy did not have a lot of francophones at that stage. So that was probably my dominant thinking. I was also thinking, okay, what am I going to do now?
So the fact that they are doing this today, could you have imagined all those years ago, 1970 was when it happened, right? That this day would come, that things would change this much?
Never in my wildest dreams. This is just and to have heard the Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau sort of talk about the bedroom of the nation and so on, and now his son about to issue a very broad apology from what we're expecting, and this is just almost miraculous.
And also maybe necessary. Letourneau picked up his life and moved forward. He says others did not fare as well.
Indeed, all Canadians missed out on important contributions you would have made to our society. You were not bad soldiers, sailors, airmen and women. You were not predators, and you were not criminals.
I know you're not a kind of guy that cries, but did you have a moment there where you thought, oh?
He hit it, well, yes, I suppose I did, so it became personal at that point. I thought he was speaking to me specifically. It related to what had happened to me, as someone who was willing to serve the country loyally and competently, who suddenly was being told that he didn't measure up anymore.
Does anything feel different now? Do you feel different at all?
Yeah, I'm just happy that the government has done this. We've been waiting for it for a long time, and from my perspective, what was done today was impressive.
Thousands of federal workers were fired from the 1950s to as late as the 90s as part of what many have come to call the gay purge, a dark chapter in Canada's history.
I think by getting it out in the open and discussing homosexuality is a very, very grave problem indeed. I think
this was not so long ago.
Do you think that they are in any way a danger to our society?
I believe they are.
A time when homosexuality was considered not only to be a criminal act, but a mental illness.
I think they should be locked up.
Do you think that they should be put away? Do you think that they are a danger, a menace?
Yes, definitely.
Changes began slowly, starting in 1967, when Pierre Trudeau, then Justice Minister, introduced massive changes to the criminal code.
There's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation, and I think that, what's done in private between adults doesn't concern the criminal code.
Those famous words resonated loudly, and 2 years later, homosexuality was formally decriminalized. But societal change would take much longer.
If a number of homosexuals get control of a particular area of a government department, then to be promoted, you have to be a homosexual. It becomes a little society of its own.
With the Cold War looming large, many in the government of the day considered LGBT people as a threat to public security, fearing they could be blackmailed by Soviets into giving up government secrets. People were followed, pictures taken, interrogated about their private lives. An RCMP unit called Section A3 embarked on a mission to suss out and remove all gays from the civil service.
They were showing naked or semi-naked images of women and men.
Even developing a device to test for homosexuality known as the fruit machine.
If the pupil dilated when they were being shown a naked image of someone of the same gender, that this was an indicator that they were actually homosexual.
Not surprisingly, the machine never did work, but the damage was done. The gay purge ruined lives and careers. And it didn't end until 1992, when the military began accepting openly gay Canadians. 25 years later, today's apology shows how far this country has come. But as Catherine Cullen tells us, some say there's still lots of work to do.
It is our collective shame that you were so mistreated.
It was a profound moment, watching the apology in a military armory. And not just for people directly affected. Gemma Hickey never lost a job or got arrested for being transgender, but this still felt personal.
As an activist that's been out in the public, I have received death threats. I've had to involve police. I've been spit on. I've had my property damaged. So for the Prime Minister of Canada to stand up and apologize, I really felt that in my heart today.
But what happens now?
It is my hope that we will look back on today as a turning point. But there is still much more work to do ahead of us.
The apology is a first step. It's a very big step. We've only scratched the surface.
Hickey has fought for gender-neutral birth certificates and says in much of the country that battle continues.
Well, as it stands right now, non-binary individuals are invisible.
We can't forget our past.
People watching the apology in Toronto had other concerns.
I think we really need to focus on the experiences of young people who may not have their parental support for their identities.
I would say one of those big ones for me would be end the blood ban for gay folks.
In the last election, the Liberals called the ban on blood donations from men who had sex with men discriminatory and pledged to end it. 2 years later, the government is still funding new medical research aimed at getting the ban lifted.
Am I happy where we are? No. Do we have more work to do? Yes. And that's why our government stepped up to make sure the funding is there so that we can follow the science and get this work done.
Work to do after absorbing the weight of today's embrace. Catherine Cullen, CBC News, Ottawa.
Wasn't all nonpartisan support in the House today. It's Ottawa, after all. The opposition went after Bill Morneau about a 2015 sale of stock in his family business. That was days before he made a motion to raise taxes on high-income earners. The value of the shares dropped, and the insinuation by the opposition is that Morneau benefited. He responded today by threatening a lawsuit.
The opposition clearly has no idea how the stock market works. If they'd like a lesson in how the stock market works, of course, I'm happy to give it to them. But I can say with absolute certainty, if they want a lesson in how the legal system works, They just need to take those allegations outside the House, and I'll give it to them.
Should tell you, Adrian, that Pierre Poilievre, a Conservative MP, did go outside and pose some of those same questions to Bill Morneau, who was not in question period today.
He found him. You know, Rosie, I think we should just let you know that we're keeping an eye on something that's sort of developing at the moment. This is the fallout of another dangerous act of defiance by North Korea, a missile that crashed into the Sea of Japan this evening. But that missile was a message. It has the rest of the world on alert. North Korea launched it in the middle of the night after months of relative quiet, and it went further than anything they have ever fired before. So this is the missile's estimated trajectory. It looks almost impossible, 4,500 kilometers up. For reference, the space station orbits at about 400 kilometers. So why so high? The North Koreans are trying to make a point. 4,500 kilometers up translates to about 13,000 kilometers laterally. So this missile had the capacity to hit Los Angeles, Toronto, or New York. Donald Trump had this to say.
We'll take care of it. We have General Mattis in the room with us, and we've had a long discussion on it. It is a situation that we will handle.
It went higher, frankly, than any previous shot they've taken. It's a research and development effort on their part to continue building ballistic missiles that could threaten everywhere in the world.
And that is South Korea responding by launching its own missiles in a show of force and joining a chorus of global condemnation. Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland and U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson have announced that Canada and the U.S. will co-host a conference on the North Korean threat in Canada early next year, a meeting in the works since September. Asia correspondent Sasha Petrusik is in Beijing, where it is already Wednesday. So, Sasha, it's been, 2.5 months since North Korea last launched a ballistic missile. What do you make of that gap?
Well, that really does have some observers stumped. It could be that Pyongyang was just feeling an accumulation of insults from Donald Trump, from his speeches and tweets, and from being put on the international list of state sponsors of terror. Or it could have been simply that North Korea needs to keep testing if it wants to become the nuclear power that it insists it is going to be.
Also, you know, I know we've been reading that normally these launches are at dawn. This one was in the middle of the night. Any idea why?
Yeah, that was puzzling. This is really a first. It could be that this was the result of fears from Pyongyang that the Americans might try to interfere with this launch. They've been running their bombers and fighter jets up and down the coast as a show of force. They might have wanted to do it under the cover of darkness. Or it could have been a technical issue. Some technical experts have suggested that by firing this thing at nighttime, like they might do in a real situation, it would give the rockets an extra boost to make it to the east coast of the United States, which would be the target, but the rockets aren't quite ready to go there yet.
Okay, entirely possible. Asia correspondent Sasha Petrusik in Beijing. Thanks. It was pretty clear North Korea was up to something. Satellites spotted movement of materials over the last 48 hours. Yesterday, South Koreans reported missile tracing radar was switched on at a North Korean base. Slivers of evidence are all you can glean from a country that from space is as dark as it is isolated. So how do we know what North Korea is really up to? That's our question of the day. Some look for answers in the sea.
The sea is a far better place for North Korea to get access to these materials. It's murkier, it's harder to track.
Robert Hewish of Dalhousie University has recently seen ships stop broadcasting their location right as they near North Korean waters. He suspects some vessels are trying to skirt the sanctions in the name of keeping North Korea's nuclear program functioning.
To have any sort of aggressive weapons program that involves nuclear material or intercontinental ballistic missiles, you require fuel, you require resources, you require parts, you even require computer programs. There are so few boats actually entering North Korean waters, the list of suspects just got a lot smaller.
Then there are the images North Korea releases on purpose. It's pumped up propaganda. Only sometimes in those pictures, there is intel likely leaked out by accident. Scott Lafoy is an imagery analyst with a specialty in missile programs. We went to him because in the blur of propaganda, he sees what the rest of us don't.
In July of last year, Kim Jong-un oversaw the launch of several Scud missiles. He oversaw the launch of these missiles from a highway that was basically two-lane highway, split down the middle with shrubbery. And then his camo tent, he very frequently will travel with this tent with screens up to protect the location that he's at, makes it harder for him to be found, makes it harder for people like us or governments to predict where he is going to be for the next test. But there is a small yellow signature that showed up, and this yellow stripe is a hazard marker from a tunnel. And there's only a few places in North Korea that have both this kind of hazard marker and this type of road. So we narrowed it down to about 3 locations, 4 locations he possibly could be in, and one that he very likely was in, the site. It helps us predict how their missiles work and sort of what level of technology they're at. In this case, it showed us they have increased mobility with their missile systems and that they are not locked in place, which allows us to sort of predict where, in the event of war, what their operational area would look like.
The imagery may even be able to reveal who is helping North Korea. Have a look at these engines, specifically what's known as their plumbing. Lafoy says the designs echo those of the former Soviet Union. And those 2 tubes on this North Korean missile truck, awfully similar to a famous Russian ICBM truck. Now, it's not proof. These are educated hunches from analysts hanging on to every pixel, every sound from the hermit nation. And you know, Andrew, the thing is, one thing we know for sure is that with each new test, there's always a burst of imagery to analyze, and they're just waiting for it.
Yeah, a whole new set of consequences and repercussions, too. Well, an Ontario man accused in a massive hack of Yahoo email accounts pleaded guilty today in a U.S. court. 22-year-old Karim Baratov was arrested last spring. Prosecutors accused him of helping Russian intelligence officers to carry out a cyber attack that affected 500 million Yahoo accounts. Baratov faces a maximum of 10 years in prison. Well, an attempt to discredit one of the United States' most respected newspapers has failed. It all started when a woman named Jamie Phillips contacted the Washington Post about Roy Moore. That's the Alabama Senate candidate, caught up in a whirlwind of sexual assault allegations. She said Moore impregnated her when she was 15 and forced her to have an abortion. But reporters were suspicious of some of her details and her online ties to a conservative media movement as well. They also noted she repeatedly demanded assurances that a Post story would bring Moore down. So they set up a meeting.
And are you in contact with other people? Are you in contact with the Roy Moore campaign or Steve Bannon or Breitbart or?
Not at all.
Do you still have an interest in working in the conservative media movement to combat the lies and deceit of the liberal MSM? Is that still your interest?
No, not really.
Yeah.
Not at this point.
No.
Apparently exposed, Phillips soon left and went straight to the offices of Project Veritas, an alt-right conservative group that routinely targets mainstream media outlets, including the Washington Post.
And what's the franchise?
The fact that the entire scheme failed highlights just how important it is to be journalistically diligent. But as Paul Hunter shows us, this was just a shot across the bow in what looks like an escalating war on journalism itself.
In this case, evidently, it backfired.
Sorry to have brought you all the way out here.
Okay.
An apparent attempt by the woman on the right to pass on an ugly and intentionally false story to the reporter on the left about Republican Senate contender Roy Moore, aimed at embarrassing the paper. But the Post had too many questions in return.
Well, I guess you'd call it a botched sting. The goal, of course, was to then, after the story would have been published, to expose it as false and therefore discredit our previous reporting on allegations against Roy Moore, and then also cast doubt on any future claims that might be made against the would-be senator.
It was the Post that first reported Moore is an alleged child molester, turning his run for the Senate on its ear. How better to deflect attention on that than to discredit those who told the story? In the U.S. these days, it's become almost a thing. The same group said to have targeted the Post, conservative-backed Project Veritas, this summer secretly recorded a CNN producer commenting on coverage of Russian meddling in last year's election.
It's mostly bullshit right now. Like, we don't have any big giant proof.
The White House jumped on it.
If the media can't be trusted to report the news, then that's a dangerous place for America.
Like other videos published by Veritas, the CNN clip was quickly debunked. The producer didn't even cover politics. True or untrue, it's all part of what's become a familiar and powerful refrain.
You are fake news.
I like real news, not fake news. You're fake news.
The fake news, the enemy of the people. And they are.
Leaving just enough voters to wonder, right or wrong, who to believe, except when it doesn't work. On MSNBC this summer, a warning from Rachel Maddow that her show had just discovered they'd been approached with fake documents, a trap, she called it.
We don't know who's doing it, but we're working on it.
One lesson:
my hope is that it's a reminder of the care that reporters take in pursuing these kinds of stories. It doesn't mean that we're perfect, but it does mean that we are not just printing accusations willy-nilly without any vetting.
In other words, turns out the mainstream media knows how to do its job. Paul Hunter, CBC News, Washington.
Remember a certain engagement announcement yesterday? Well, many British media outlets have spent today on a not-so-critical task, figuring out exactly what Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were saying when the mics were turned off. Some even hired lip readers.
Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, thank you both very much.
Thank you so much.
Now, there are a few minutes of outtakes of the couple laughing and chatting, with no sound, of course. There is no consensus on what this joke was about, but here, apparently, the prince jokes about Markle always interrupting him, and Markle apparently responds with a teasing show of listening intently. And the details of the wedding day have started to emerge. St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle will be the venue. It holds about 800 guests. The wedding day will be sometime in May, and the royal family will pay for the core elements of the ceremony and the reception. There will be a few big changes for Markle. She'll be baptized into the Church of England before the wedding day, and she will become a UK citizen right afterwards.
Still ahead on The National. Thousands of travelers trapped, and people are being told to get out. Why scientists are worried that a volcano in Bali could blow soon.
Of lobsters and what defines a livelihood in Nova Scotia.
And vacancy rates in Canada's biggest cities are next to zero. We have stories of young people who cannot find a place to live.
I had an amazing life in Vancouver, and when it got to the point where I couldn't have an amazing life there, I left.
Martine Waugh and Todd Ross came to Parliament Hill to get an apology. As teens in the 80s, they were both in the military and harassed and hounded out of their careers for being gay.
They arrest me, then they send me to the psychiatrist who has to see if I was normal or unnormal. And me, I told them I was confused. I'm not sure if I love men, if I love women. It's maybe just a phase.
She was dishonorably discharged in 1985 for homosexuality.
I was so depressed. I wanted to die. I wanted to kill myself.
Ross hadn't even admitted to himself he was gay, but after being strapped to multiple lie detectors, he finally confessed it to an interrogator.
It was such a traumatic thing to do, to be sitting in this room, hooked up to a machine, looking at a two-way mirror, sitting beside the stranger, and then having to come out.
In 1990, Ross was expelled from the Navy.
I suffered from depression when this was happening. A couple times I tried to commit suicide.
Now they want an apology from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in compensation for those affected.
This practice, which we've called the LGBT purge, began in the 1950s when LGBT Canadians were viewed as a threat to national security and as criminal deviants.
Just last week, the Parliamentary Defence Committee voted unanimously in favor of amending the service records of those in the same situation as Waugh and Ross. Today, the Defence Minister couldn't say when that would happen.
Discrimination of any kind, whether it's sexual orientation, gender, ethnicity, is absolutely unacceptable, and it will be stomped out.
But some of those who were persecuted have waited over 30 years for this to be stomped out. And nearly 1/3 of those who were discharged because of their sexual orientation have passed away.
I'm not going to have Mr. Trudeau apologize to a cemetery.
On the National tonight, a dark side to Ottawa's football festivities. Police say they've rescued 2 young women in a prostitution blitz over the Grey Cup weekend. They carried out raids at 11 hotels across the city and identified 20 women and 1 man whose sexual services were being sold. No arrests, but police are still investigating who is behind the trafficking. Meanwhile, in BC tonight, the province is investigating 2 fish processing plants after this video was posted online. Now, according to the person who shot it, that's bloody wastewater being pumped into the ocean by 2 separate Vancouver Island facilities. He also says he had it tested and found it's contaminated with a virus that could harm wild salmon. But one of the companies involved says it disinfects effluent before it's released, and a positive test result doesn't mean the virus came from them. Now, we're also keeping a close eye on Bali tonight, where Mount Agung is threatening to blow. It's technically already erupting, spewing volcanic ash thousands of meters into the air. But with what locals are calling rays of fire seeping out, they're worried it could explode. 100,000 people near that volcano have been told to get out. Some wind up in makeshift shelters like this one, but others are staying put, refusing to leave their homes. There are Canadians there too, many of them stranded because flights off the island have all been canceled.
One friend that we have here is getting on a bus at 6 a.m. He's going to drive 18 hours, apparently through a jungle. There's a swamp. There's some sort of canoe or a boat that's going to take him to an island where, there might be an airport that might still be open. At this point, you're trying to figure out what the right thing to do is. Do you sit tight and hope that, the worst of it is over, or is it actually going to erupt and we should get the heck out of here as soon as possible?
Now, worth noting here, volcanoes come in lots of different shapes and sizes, and turns out this one is particularly dangerous. We asked our own seismologist and scientist, Johanna Wagstaff, to tell us why.
Mount Agung is a stratovolcano, meaning it's cone-shaped. Those can produce the most violent explosions. Imagine all of the magma deep within is heating up water and creating pressure that's building towards a small point at the top of the volcano. Its steep slopes can send lava rushing down the mountainside at high speeds. And we know how deadly that is because we've seen it before. The last time this volcano blew was in 1963. More than 1,000 people died, most of them because of the blast and lava. The other danger is mud flows. When the earth shakes, so much can break loose, and with all that rock and debris spewing out, rain can turn that into fast-flowing rivers, destroying everything in its path.
And Johanna's here to tell us more about the impact, because, Joe, how wide of an area are we actually talking here that's under direct threat from that volcano?
Well, Andrew, the evacuation radius is about 12 kilometers from the volcano. That's based on topography, as well as the ash cloud that is a threat to planes. Not everyone in the evacuation zone, though, has left. Some people are just wearing masks and hope that when an eruption does happen, they can make it out in time.
And is it a foregone conclusion that the volcano will erupt in a giant explosion?
Not necessarily. There is a scenario where the gas may just release gradually over a longer period of time. So scientists are watching signs and clues very closely. One of them is earthquakes. We can tell that the magma is getting closer to the surface based on earthquake activity. We're also monitoring and measuring the temperature of the gases that are being released to see, again, if that magma is getting closer to the surface. So all signs are pointing towards a major eruption, even though it isn't a done deal. But these are all the same clues we had before the 1963 eruption, Andrew.
Okay, Johanna Wagstaff, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Nova Scotia's lucrative lobster industry opened again today. First Nations fishermen can catch enough for a moderate livelihood. But what is that?
We know what it's not. We know what poverty looks like.
with 80% of First Nation communities in Nova Scotia living below the poverty line, we know what it's not.
The battle over hundreds of millions of dollars. That's later on The National.
And up next, we'll have the lowdown on sky-high rent in Canadian cities, which has made apartment hunting sobering and too often smelly.
One room I looked at was covered in bird excrement, and that was $800 a month, and she wanted a caretaker for her bird as well.
It's widely accepted that the oceans are changing, and the research being done here is looking at how those differences are affecting the reproductive life cycle of lobsters. In a dark, buzzing room, more than 100 female lobsters are helping predict the future. Lobsters are sensitive to changes in water temperature. A study in the Bay of Fundy in 2015 found warmer temperatures were linked with a decrease in the number of lobster eggs. This study is looking at much more. Not much work has been done on how lobster eggs have been affected by changes in temperature or ocean acidification. So this lab is working to change that. 108 females are in different tanks with different temperature conditions. And carbon dioxide is pumped in, mirroring increased emissions found in the environment which the ocean absorbs. Combine all that with different diet limitations, and these lobsters are being put through the paces. All this information could be put into climate change responses or fisheries management models.
What we're noticing so far is that depending on the treatment, some of the individuals are either producing less eggs or they're resorbing their eggs. So that means that they're not actually spawning.
At the moment, this research project will last about 9 months or so. They're currently hoping to see if they can stretch it out. But one thing that they're really looking at is multiple generations of lobsters going through the same inflicted scenarios. That way they might be able to predict what could happen in these situations down the line. Ari.
And this is our tag here for food and ceremonial.
This is what the fuss is over. The Sabakanakani banned food, social, and ceremonial fishery in St. Mary's Bay this summer. Band member Dave McDonald says he follows the rules and keeps the lobsters landed in the 3 traps he's allowed.
I haven't sold my catch, or anybody I do know isn't selling their catch.
But protests have erupted from commercial fishermen claiming Indigenous harvesters routinely sell their catches, something prohibited under the food fishery. They want DFO to stop it.
We believe in that, but how come the moderate living ain't there then?
First Nations fishermen like Dave McDonald won the right to fish for a moderate living 18 years ago in the Marshall decision. The landmark Supreme Court of Canada case ruled the Mi'kmaq are entitled to make a moderate livelihood from the fishery, but the federal government and the Mi'kmaq have never been able to agree on a regime that would allow First Nations to pursue a moderate livelihood fishery. Negotiations have been underway for 8 years.
They are difficult decisions. The fishery resource is highly sought after by all parties.
DFO insists that it regulate every fishery.
In order to have a sustainable use of the resource, we have to have a regulated fishery. We have to know how many participants. We have to know what amount of gear they're using.
The department has moved to integrate First Nations into the commercial fishery. Bands have accumulated dozens of commercial licenses. Some they rent to non-natives. Dave McDonald says those licenses don't do him any good.
Because I can't afford $40,000.
That's what you have to pay the band in order to
go fish these licenses. And I don't feel I should have to do that.
As for tensions this summer, well, he saw it firsthand when he tried to move his food fishery to Shelburne County.
I was over in Cape Sable Island, and I was threatened to be killed, burn my boat. They cut my boat loose 2 or 3 times. They tell me we don't want no natives here.
This is one of the nicer rooms I've seen. I mean, I've looked at some really awful places, and it has a floor and a desk and a bed. It's lovely.
You're hearing Sharna Ridge there. She's a young professional, a new arrival to Toronto, taking stock of her rental options. And if you get the feeling that those options aren't great, check out the latest numbers from the CMHC. The average rent in Canada blasting upwards at twice the rate of inflation, now sitting at $947 a month. But as with everything in real estate, location matters. This is what your average two-bedroom costs in Vancouver and Toronto. And rental vacancy rates in those two cities sit at about 1%. In Alberta and Quebec, it's a bit more reasonable, but in many urban centres, this isn't even close to a renter's market. That dream house has been soaring out of reach for a while, and now that nice apartment is starting to look like a fantasy too. Jacqueline Hansen has more on the no vacancy reality.
It's a bit of a funny smell. Is everything okay, or with the room?
That voice is 27-year-old Sharna Ridge. She thinks the smell is urine.
I was just asking, is there a plumbing issue? There's a bit of a smell.
The cost to live here, $650 a month.
Down there, is that more rooms?
Ridge filmed this for us to show what it's been like trying to find a room to rent.
One room I looked at was covered in bird excrement, and that was $800 a month, and she wanted a caretaker for her bird as well.
This is basement room.
At her temporary sublet, she showed us more.
So to have this room for $500, that's considered almost lucky.
The bed barely fits in it.
Yeah. Do I want to live in a shoebox and just barely live at all, really?
Housing is becoming unattainable.
As Toronto's former chief city planner, Jennifer Keesmaat knows the city's weak spots well, but also its powerful draws: jobs, cultural opportunities, diversity, and where it's growing, like this neighborhood. There are more buildings going up here than in all of Boston.
But at the same time, we're not actually seeing those units becoming more and more affordable. It used to be that when we talked about affordable housing, we actually worried about social housing. Really what we're talking about today is people who are able to be fully employed, but are not able to afford housing. We are missing an entire housing type in our city right now.
Housing rights are human rights.
The main focus of the government's new 10-year national housing strategy is social housing, and that's an important starting point, according to Keesmaat. But she also wants to see faster access to more affordable rentals.
We cannot recognize the urgency of this situation enough.
Downtown Toronto, it's hard to go far without coming across a high-rise under construction or plans for more posted like this. But most of these buildings are condos, and the average unit costs more than $500,000, and rents for more than $2,000. It's not just Toronto that's becoming less attainable. Vancouver's reputation for its great quality of life is being overshadowed by its affordability crisis.
I honestly was so burnt out on every level by the time I left Vancouver that I needed to be with my family. Make it nice and savory.
Jessica Barrett is taking a break here in Edmonton on her way to start a new life in Calgary. She spent 15 years in Vancouver, first as a student, then as a journalist.
I would have to keep freelancing on the side on top of a very demanding full-time job just to make up, the rent.
Barrett wrote about a city at risk of losing its young, vibrant professionals like her, but feeling defeated, she left.
Are we really gonna be okay with a society in which anybody who has a young family or is a teacher or a social worker or a journalist or an artist can't afford to live there? Like, you're just gonna be okay with that.
I try to get the pictures of the CN Tower, the skylines of Toronto, just because it reflects the you made it mindset in the big city.
Bibin Joseph is 24 years old. He's optimistic that Toronto is still a city of possibilities.
I tell people the reason I want to move to Toronto because it's the New York of Canada.
Even though the first room for rent he could find,
it was what's the word I'm looking for? It's probably like a chaos. I didn't expect there to be around 8 to 10 people staying in one big house.
His room is cramped and it smells of heavy smoke, someone else's.
Joseph wants to get out.
I've been telling my friends, hey, how was Toronto? Do you enjoy it? I was like, honestly, all I've been doing is working and looking at places. So that's all I've been doing. I miss Edmonton a lot more now because I left a lot of comforts to come to a city where I'm struggling.
The prosperity that we see as a country and in our cities is at risk if we do not address housing affordability, particularly in Vancouver and Toronto.
I don't want to go home because I'm homeless due to a housing crisis.
I'll never say like I'll move back to Edmonton because I feel like I lost in Toronto. And I have this attitude like to never give up.
I had an amazing life in Vancouver, and when it got to the point where I couldn't have an amazing life there, I left.
All determined to find a home, but only willing to sacrifice so much. Jacqueline Hansen, CBC News, Toronto.
Despacito, quiero respirar tu cuello despacito. Deja que te diga cosas al oído, para que te acuerdes si no estás conmigo.
That song, Despacito, bore a hole through speakers this year. You're welcome for that earworm. One version of the video was the most viewed on YouTube ever, and thanks to Justin Bieber's vocal contributions to the song, he is now up for 2 Grammys, one of more than a dozen Canadians listed as nominees for the 60th Annual Grammy Awards.
I'm leaving the table. I'm out of the game.
Hard to say what the late legend Leonard Cohen would think of his 2 nominations, but he is in this game. So too are some newcomers, like Toronto R&B artist Daniel Caesar, who's up for 2. There are the usual suspects, of course. The Weeknd has a chance to snag another Grammy for his collection.
Make it on my own, but I don't wanna grow up. We can stay forever young.
And Brampton, Ontario native Alicia Cara is up for 4 Grammys. Just a few on an impressive list. Of course, on January 28th, we'll see which of these nominees actually closes the deal.
I think it's absolutely outrageous. I don't know how they expect us to live.
Stephanie Thurston, her partner, and 5 children have lived here on Forest Road for 4 years. They live in what the city calls low end of market housing. They've been rented to tenants like Thurston at a flat rate under a 35-year agreement with the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. But when that agreement expires in January, the city will rent these units based on tenants' incomes.
So any revenues that we do gain through low end of market housing go to subsidize our non-profit houses for folks who are at the lowest end of the housing market, the lowest end of affordability, who would otherwise be facing homelessness.
So now we're pretty much forced to leave because we cannot afford the increase.
Under the new formula, Thurston's rent will jump from $730 to a whopping $1,588 a month.
We're getting penalized because we're working. We need to work to take care of our families. So now we're pretty much forced to leave because we cannot afford the increase.
In the words of the city councillor for the area, the raw numbers here are jarring. But Hope Jameson believes the city should make these units available to people who earn less than Thurston and her partner.
It's great that these folks seem to have earned their way out of social housing and they may be ready to move on.
And that's exactly what Thurston says she's getting ready to do. Many of her neighbors who also faced big rent increases have already moved. And as the city moves to apply its income test to other tenants, many people across the city will face the same decision. Mark Quinn, CBC News, St. John's.
What the NDP wants to do is scrap what's called the vacate or move out clause. And what that does is create a loophole that allows landlords to increase the rent every time someone moves out and as high as they want. How it works is this. When you sign a fixed term lease, like for example, a 1-year lease, you tick a box called a vacate clause. And that means at the end of your lease, you have 2 options. You either move out or sign a new lease. If you want to stay at your rental apartment, you have to sign a new lease. And under a new lease, your landlord can raise the rent as high as they want. What tenants should be allowed to do if they want to stay in their rental is continue on a month-to-month basis. And if they do, they're protected under tenancy laws to only have the rent go up by about 4% a year. Today, the Minister of Housing, Selena Robinson, announced the government is introducing legislation that would effectively scrap the vacate clause from leases, meaning if you want to stay at your rental unit at the end of your lease, you won't be forced to sign a new lease. And after the lease comes up, it will become a month-to-month rental contract.
And today, I'm very pleased to say that our government has introduced legislative amendments that will fix this problem and give renters in BC the security they need, the security they deserve.
This piece of legislation is being supported by Landlord BC, a provincial group, as well as TRAC, a tenant resource centre. But there is a loophole. A landlord can still evict the tenant and then turn around and increase the rent for the next tenant. And one way to do that is to simply break the law. Under current laws, a landlord can give a 2-month eviction notice out for 2 reasons. One, if the landlord or a family member is moving into the unit, or if the landlord needs to conduct major construction, or if that building is being demolished. What a landlord can do is evict a tenant saying it's for one of those reasons. It's dumping day in southwestern Nova Scotia. That means thousands of commercial fishermen can set their traps and open the lobster season. But a stunning day on the water masks a serious dispute involving a big number. $493 million. That was the value of last year's catch here, the second highest ever in this, Canada's richest lobster fishing area. A lot at stake, so it really matters who is allowed to fish and how, and that's where the dispute comes in, putting First Nations against non-Indigenous fishermen in a fight that has boiled over. Tom Murphy went dockside to find out how and if it can be solved.
The woman behind the wheel of that car, she's on a mission.
If I don't do something now, nobody else is doing anything.
That's Cheryl Maloney, a mother, a Mi'kmaq, a law school graduate, and someday she hopes a fish boat captain.
I have young boys that, we wanted them to enter the fishery under our treaty rights. It's so important.
She wants her family to earn what the courts have said the Mi'kmaq are entitled to, a moderate livelihood, which to Maloney simply means a decent living. Problem is, Ottawa and the First Nations can't agree on what it is. This is her personal quest to push the government to once and for all define what a moderate livelihood really is.
We know what it's not. We know what poverty looks like. With 80% of First Nation communities in Nova Scotia living below the poverty line, we know what it's not. And for the government to continuously try to use that definition or what that definition means, it's a further violation of our Aboriginal rights and our human rights. So instead of waiting for that, maybe that's something we'll test. Maybe we'll go fishing and they want to test what moderate livelihood means. We've been winning hundreds and hundreds of cases. We will win in court again.
It's why Maloney is looking to buy a boat and go fishing without a license, whether Ottawa likes it or not. Entering into a serious game of dare you with DFO to bring this matter back before the courts. There are plenty who don't like what Maloney and others like her are doing. They call them poachers. Patience is running low, tension is high. Already 2 boats, one of them Indigenous, the other one non-Indigenous, have been set on fire. Frustrated fishermen gather en masse in silent protest at DFO offices, many fearing to speak out.
Oh, I don't know.
No one wants their boat to be next.
So they catch a few lobsters? Oh yeah, we got a few lobsters. Yeah, we did a decent day. Well, we got our quota for each, right?
First Nations already have limited access to the commercial fishery, and they can also fish a small amount any time of year for something called food, social, and ceremonial purposes, basically for feasts and special events back at the reserves, something Michael Peter Pettipaw says he does.
Now, are these food and ceremonial? These are food ceremonial. These are going home. I put them in storage till I make the trip home. Will you sell them?
No. Those are for us.
So you're allowed under the law. There's no problem with you fishing these lobsters
they can
right
come
now.
in here. The DFO, they come here. They can inspect them. They can have free will at my lobsters.
The Mi'kmaq are not allowed to sell those food, social, and ceremonial lobsters, but some are in large amounts in a black market.
But we're trying to make a moderate living, but they ain't going to allow us, or try to. But I'm going to be making a living because I'm going to fight the rig to the end myself.
Would you like to get it back in court again and have a...
Oh, I'm going there. There's no two ways about it.
This fall, DFO set up a sting operation, inserting microchips and lobsters in multiple illegal traps. It led to the seizure of 3 tons of those lobsters.
They want to fish and cheese. Like food fisheries, all right, but there's more than the food fishery going on.
So, non-Indigenous fishermen ask, DFO, why aren't there more criminal charges?
It's a big money fishery too, isn't it?
The lobster fishery is particularly lucrative.
David Worley of DFO understands the frustration, but urges calm.
And you don't want to get too caught up in charges there. I mean, I think the measure of an effective enforcement program is compliance rather than the charge rate. So there's been, I think, a good deal of education through the fall and the summer. I'm hoping that something good comes out of this and that it's clearer as we move ahead.
But what we saw this summer and this fall were non-native fishermen who were frustrated with you because they felt DFO wasn't enforcing the rules.
That's true, and we've heard that as well. And in response to that, I'd say there's a few things. There's a view that enforcement is exclusively on the water work. And I think that the nature of enforcement is changing. Enforcement's taken a balanced and a measured approach.
The treaty gave them a new right to engage in a commercial fishery.
Michael Donovan is a lawyer who has handled numerous Aboriginal cases and is watching all of this unfold.
An arrest would get it before the courts, which would probably start a process that would take the next 5 years or so. I think if there's dissatisfaction with the way it's being administered now, the best solution would be for consultations and negotiations to take place between the federal government and the Mi'kmaq bands.
Might that explain why DFO might be reluctant to lay a charge?
Possibly. If the consultation takes place first, then you're not stuck in a legal battle that goes on for years, only to find that, yes, the way it's being handled now violates a treaty right.
If a native fisherman takes lobster ashore but does not have a commercial license and then tries to sell them, what will you tell your officers to do?
Well, it's going to depend on the specific situation. I mean, I think in general, it's a case of education around that.
If anything meaningful was happening, somebody would be talking to me and saying, Cheryl, hold on. We're going to get you out there on the water.
And so, as negotiations with Ottawa over what a moderate livelihood really is drag on, the tension remains. And Cheryl Maloney vows to keep making waves.
Yeah, we're going to get out there fishing.
Tom Murphy, CBC News, Saulnieville, Nova Scotia.
The government has now taken a step. The minister has appointed a negotiator to help reconcile fisheries rights. Talks will include First Nations in the Maritimes and Quebec.
Well, still ahead, is Toronto really a CFL town? We ask fans as they celebrate their Grey Cup. But first,
I'm glad to be alive. I'm so glad. And everybody, first response team, I want to thank Search and Rescue, everybody in the community, just strangers. I'm just so glad to be alive. I'm just so happy.
Annette Poitras is heading home after nearly a week in hospital. She was rescued after spending 2 nights lost in the BC wilderness. Poitras was walking 3 dogs when she tripped on a log and was knocked unconscious. But turns out one of those dogs helped get her out alive.
Roxy was a big help. That's who kept her warm at night. And, you know, she was the one that barked when the rescuers were close.
She was the one that got a hold of the SAR. Like, she was barking and barking. I was too weak. I couldn't call out. I was too weak. I saw that helicopter over and over and over again. And if I stayed one more night, Thursday, I didn't think I was going to make it.
When people talk about immigration, they often talk about money. But is immigration good or bad for an economy? Here are the facts.
High levels of immigration tend to expand the total size of an economy. More people in Canada means more people buying clothes, groceries, and cars. More people equals more money being spent. So our economy gets bigger, but that doesn't necessarily mean more money for everyone. Typically, in developed countries, GDP per capita doesn't increase much. At least, not initially. New immigrants tend to have much lower earnings than their Canadian-born counterparts. During their first years in Canada, they don't pay as much tax as the average Canadian, and they're more likely to get help from the government. But that changes over time. A Carleton economics prof says, in terms of social assistance, immigrants eventually become like the rest of the population, and in time are no greater drain on government services than people born in Canada. So eventually, immigrants don't need more social assistance than Canadians. But what about their impact on the job situation? According to the experts we spoke to, immigration does have some initial negative impacts on wages and employment. That's because an influx of people working for lower wages brings down averages in an area. But that's short term. Long term, the impact on workers is neutral. Not a benefit, not a burden. Newcomers are also more entrepreneurial than the general population once they get comfortable in their new country. Business ownership rates are higher among immigrants who've been in Canada for a decade or more. But they're more likely to have a service or a retail startup, and their businesses tend to be on a smaller scale than their Canadian counterparts. Think of it this way. If you take 100 immigrants and 100 people born in Canada, the immigrants will start more businesses, but they'll employ fewer people in total. But having an influx of immigrants is still valuable for a country like Canada with an aging population. All those retiring boomers mean taxpayers will be on the hook for higher healthcare costs, benefits, and government services. Low-skilled immigrants can help fill labor shortages, and newcomers with a higher education, work experience, and the desire to make things happen, they can transform a country or even a sector. Case in point, Silicon Valley in the US. Of the 87 most valuable private startups, more than half were founded by immigrants. And 71% of them had immigrants in key executive roles. And there are also countless examples of immigrant success stories in Canada.
On the National tonight, a celebration in Saskatoon to remember the life of Marlene Bird. It's one of several round dances being held across the country tonight in her honor. Bird was a residential school survivor who was so badly beaten back in 2014 that she was partially blinded and lost both of her legs. She died yesterday at the age of 50. The U.S. Air Force is facing legal action tonight in connection with that mass shooting at a Texas church early this month. The parents of one of the 26 victims filed a claim, accusing the military of negligence. They say the military could have stopped gunman Devin Kelly from legally buying a gun, but that it failed to report his criminal record to a federal database. The Air Force won't comment.
Now, Toronto Argos fans had plenty to celebrate about this season today at the Grey Cup rally, including an unbelievable come-from-behind championship win. But when that team can only draw about half the fans of any of the Prairie squads, it demands the question, is Toronto really a CFL town? Ian, of course, went to find out.
There's a perception in other parts of the country that Torontonians aren't really big CFL fans.
I beg to differ that point. I think we're huge CFL fans. We may be small, but we're very mighty, and we love the Argos being at BMO Field now.
So you're a young man.
Yes.
I keep hearing that young people aren't big CFL fans.
Because, you know what, they're more NFL fans. NFL has gained the reputation, and it's just like the NBA. No one's watching the D League. However, myself as a fan, I watch it. Maybe because I'm a Canadian.
So there's a feeling that people have in other parts of the country that Torontonians aren't big CFL fans. What do you think of that?
I'm the biggest ever, and I'm defending the CFL everywhere. I had to tell people in Detroit Eatery that the NFL stinks. Come over to our game.
That's the National for November 28th. Good night, everybody.
Good night.